The danger is, are we lurching from make or break moment to make or break moment with this government?
Yes, she has to talk to the electorate, but there is another audience out there, and that other audience is the markets.
Asylum hotels, I would say, are the one policy which is the most toxic. Labour have now said, we're going to stop that, and I think if they fail to meet it, Reform will be the big beneficiaries.
How deep are Labour's problems with public opinion right now? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast, with immediate reaction to what's been billed as the most important policy announcement of this Parliament, the government's spending review. The winners, health, home building and defence. The losers, well, pretty much everyone else. The Prime Minister told the Cabinet that today marks the end of the first phase of the government, and he's probably glad to see the back of it, with the economy flatlining and each poll more painful than the last. So will Rachel Reeves' focused largesse move the dial? Will it make the lives of working people better, as she promises? Will it keep herself in the job? To discuss all of this, I'm joined by our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, who's in our Leeds studio, and from More in Common, the pollster, Luke Tryl. Luke, I mean, when Keir Starmer says this was the end of the first phase of the government, I guess he's talking about painful decisions, tough decisions, as the government talks about it, to try and fix the problems that they inherited. So what were they trying to do with this spending review?
Well, they billed it as the end of the first phase. I think it was a bit of an acknowledgement that the messaging around that first phase hadn't worked. Because we know Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer come in and they start talking about tough choices, difficult decisions. You get winter fuel, you get the pit cuts. You know, it almost looked like they were trying to pick up George Osborne's playbook from 2010.
It's all terrible.
It's all terrible, but it's all the other guy's fault that it's terrible too. Now, clearly, that hasn't landed with the public. You know, the public are very weary, they're exhausted. They think they've had language about tough choices for 16 years. And one of the things we know is that, you know, when people elect the Tories, you ask people what the Tories at the best are like, it's creating economic stability. When you ask people why they vote for Labour, number one on the list is protecting the working class, followed by looking after public services. And so I just felt that messaging never worked for them. Obviously, economic stability is important, but it wasn't what people expected from a Labour government. And I think what you've seen today is an attempt to pivot to set out a distinctly Labour vision of what they're going to do for the next few years and try and give some purpose and definition to their government, which, you know, from my conversations with the public, particularly in focus groups, they haven't got to date.
Yes, but what they've also talked about is the need for people to feel the change. And if you look at the big spending decisions, which is the NHS increasing at 3%, defence edging up to 2.6%, but then not really getting to 3% yet. Is that going to actually make people feel better?
Well, it's absolutely true. Look, you know, figures in a book will not shift the dial in the polls. People have to feel it day to day. The one thing I would say is that when you talk to people about the NHS, already their stories are not great, but a little bit less bad than they were a year ago. So I think people are seeing that. But I thought what was interesting was that as well as the kind of big, you know, NHS defence stuff, there were sections in her speech which were clearly aimed at more immediate gain. And in particular, that focus on place, that sense that people's high streets are too run down, that vandalism is a real problem. That's the sort of thing which makes people feel, you know, government don't care about me, they don't care about my life. And if they can make some differences there, I think it'll at least show that they're committed. You know, actually, that bit of her speech and the bit on local transport projects was almost Johnsonian in its rhetoric, and it's moved from Osborne to Johnson in the tone of the speech. And I think that's where they'll be hoping they see the gains.
Helia, what have you picked out so far as the big trends, the big moves?
I mean, as you said at the beginning, Krish, the big winner is defence. I mean, it gets this huge capital injection, 7.3%, and that kind of wipes everything else off the board. And you were talking about health. Overall, health on day-to-day is getting 2.8%. Now, that is very big compared to other departments, but actually when you look at what that is compared to the long-run average of Health settlements is about 3.6%. It's not necessarily that generous. And when you come and look at the capital budgets, Krish, actually health gets a 0 real terms increase during the spending review. So all of the capital, all of that kind of
so it's not hospitals
infrastructure. Exactly, it's economic infrastructure. What they have decided, you've got two stories here. You know, is this a choice about social infrastructure or is this a choice about economic infrastructure? And what this government is saying today, I think, is that what we're doing is about defence and economics.
And so what does that mean for the unprotected departments? I mean, you know, for years, literally, we have been putting to the top people at Labour, well, you're going to protect a couple of departments, but you're going to face real terms cuts in unprotected departments. And that is what we now know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the overall picture. Like, for example, if you look at transport, though, it has a different picture. Day to day, actually, transport is getting a bit of a rough ride to make space for, as you were saying, health. But when you look at what they're doing on capital, on investment, remember the government borrowed all this money in order to invest. You've got a huge, 3.1 increase in capital. And again, energy. Energy is one of the winners here. Not only is it getting a day-to-day increase, it's getting a capital increase. And if you extend the period, there's a bit of kind of jiggery-pokery going on with the Chancellor's figures today, in that they keep talking about not just the spending review period, but also the entire period from when they were in government. If you look at those 2 years, remember that the government actually front-loaded a lot of their spending. Energy has actually had a 16% bumper, mega huge increase in capital. And a lot of that spending has actually already happened.
So what does that mean?
One, that it is one of the big winners. Two, that a lot of the government spending has already been done in the first 2 years. It was front-loaded, but that means that it's from a higher base, so it creates a higher starting point for the spending review. But also, in addition to that, they have increased the spending for energy. So I'd say Ed Miliband must be pretty happy here. We still haven't looked at all of the details of within the department what it means and what it means for different parts of, whether it's solar panels. But overall, they will be one of the winners.
I mean, look, it's almost impossible for a government to be transformative in a spending review because they're working to the numbers they've created in the budget. But if you look at where they've prioritised, does this produce any transformation in public opinion, do you think?
Well, interesting is, so we asked in advance of the spending review, firstly, do you expect the decisions will be good for the country, bad for the country, or make no difference? And just 15% said they expected the decisions made would be good for the country. So, at least a chance.
We are institutionally pessimistic.
We are at the moment. I joke my standard public opinion presentation is why is Britain so miserable at the moment. But, it meant she had low expectations to play with.
It's part of our culture, Luke. It's part of our culture.
I think it's particularly gloomy at the moment. So low expectations. But we then asked, which departments do you think could find efficiencies and which couldn't? And it's interesting. The ones where the public were more likely to say they needed more money were health, defence, education. The ones where the public were more likely to say they could absorb reductions were the Foreign Office, Department of Culture. I mean, not huge budgets, but they are the areas where it's been cut. So I think lots of this is in line with public opinion.
But the question is, will it actually make people feel better about Labour?
Exactly. So what I expect we'll see in public opinion probably is a bit of a bump. You generally see that after this type of event, but I'm not sure you're going to see a massive transformation in the government's fortunes until people start to feel it. And the big thing is, we talk about NHS, we talk about immigration, we talk about crime. The number one issue remains the cost of living and living standards. Until that improves, it's hard to see any other metric going up as well.
How bad?
And actually, Luke, I think the difficulty here, isn't it, that a lot of the government's plans, which are based on we're going to put all of this money into building roads, building rail, creating this infrastructure, it's not necessarily going to deliver in the kind of timeframes that your focus groups are going to respond to. It might be way beyond the next few years.
Yeah, and the other thing you've got to remember is there will be a little bit of, haven't we heard this all before on that type of stuff? You know, remember Boris Johnson comes in 2019, talks about levelling up. This government looks for the first period like they're moving away from it. They seem to have, I think, rightly recognised that was a bad idea. But it's, can you convince the public that jam tomorrow is really worth it? And I think that's a hard ask given where public trust is.
Just on that, Helia, I mean, if you look at what the government's saying on housing, again, they bombard us with numbers. £39 billion sounds like a huge amount of money to go into house building, but it's over 10 years, so we're down to £3.9 billion a year. And actually,
but listen, Krish, that is bigger. That I have to say, you know, that is much bigger. The current grant is 2.3
Well, that's what I'm trying to
billion.
ask you about. So when you compare that to where we were under Rishi Sunak, how much of a difference is that going to make?
I think it's going to be pretty significant. When I've talked to kind of social housing providers, they are very happy about this. Was one of the big asks. You know, social housing really have been on their knees. They've faced real terms cuts over the last 15 years. So this package, which will be the Affordable Homes programme, is considerably, it's about 50% more than the last spending review. So I think it will deliver a significant uplift. And that's the issue, is that one of the key drivers for this government is we want to build homes, we want to build homes. And when you've been talking to social homes providers, they say, well, hang on, we can't do that. Unless the funding package is there, we can't do that, because first we have to make sure that all of our existing property is up to date, because there's a whole stream of regulation coming down the track. And second, if we have extra cash, fine, we'll build the homes. But unless that cash is there, we can't do it. And I think it's not just the money, Krish. When I've talked to people, it's the fact that it's over 10 years. In the previous spending review, the commitment was for 5 years only. And I think what they like, because they also borrow in the bond market, is to have the certainty over 10 years. So that I think will shift the needle. Will it deliver the economic growth that this government want? I don't know. But it certainly will be very helpful for the housing sector.
I mean, the big thing the government's got to try and calculate with this, Luke, is the gap between taking sensible decisions for public services and what you do in order to change public opinion about your government. So how deep are Labour's problems with public opinion right now? I mean, you know, you expect governments to always, you know, run into problems, you know, pretty much as soon as they're elected. But how entrenched is it? How firm is it? And therefore, how easy is it going to shift with incremental improvements in some public services?
Well, actually, I just take issue with one bit you said, that you'd expect it to happen almost as soon as they're elected. Actually, governments normally get a bit of a honeymoon. And what's been surprising about this government is that they just didn't have a honeymoon. Their poll ratings started to slump almost from day one, crystallised by some of those decisions around the winter fuel allowance, around the PIP cuts. They're now, you know, in our latest poll, 4 points behind Reform UK. So they're in a difficult position. And of course, they weren't elected with a huge share of the vote. They only got about a third of the vote in the election. But I think where the mistake has particularly been is, one of the questions we ask is, the government is going to have to make tough decisions. Are they doing enough to shield the vulnerable from the impact of those decisions? And only around 30% of the country think the government is either managing to shield the vulnerable or even trying. A big chunk think they're deliberately targeting the vulnerable. And so I think that is what they're going to have to shift if they're going to get out of this hole. And the problem is, despite this spending review, despite the money for the NHS, you're still going to have that big debate about the PIP cuts, which is coming up. You know, we still haven't had any clarity on things like the 2-child cap or the child poverty strategy. I only think that's where their real challenge is. Unless they can show progress there, I think it's going to be hard to get out of the hole. The flip side is, when you ask about how deep the problems are, we are in an era of extremely volatile electorates. You know, let's look at this period 4 years ago. Boris Johnson riding high, looks invincible, vaccine bound, very different picture a few years later. So things can turn around. We have, unlike in the US, where Trump could walk down the street and shoot someone, as he says, and still get 40% of the vote, we have a responsive electorate. So if Labour can start showing progress, things will move. But
it's whether the electorate will respond to this idea of stability.
Yeah.
This government has pinned so much on the idea of delivering stability and, as Helia says, long-term planning economically. And it's whether the electorate will actually look at that and go, oh, yes, I notice what they're doing, or whether they will just demand jam now.
Yeah. And I think it is a bit the latter. Look, stability is a necessary condition because people were so exhausted with what happened under the Tories, freaked out by the mini budget, but it's not a sufficient one. People actually want the feel good. And the interesting thing, again, we asked people about, how affordable do you think a night out is? Going to the cinema, taking the kids out. They said in that poll that basically all of those nice things in life were unaffordable. And I think until that changes, that sense that you're not just working to live, living to work, that you're, as a woman in Runcorn told me the day after the by-election, I'm not living, I'm just surviving. That's what's got to change if you're really going to move the dial, because that's what's also driving well, look, I might not trust reform, but I may as well roll the dice because it can't be any worse than what we've got at the moment.
Helia, there was a very prominent, very uneconomic line in the spending review where Rachel Reeves talked about an end to asylum seekers being in hotels. Yeah. Is that the kind of line you would expect in a statement like this?
I mean, it's also in the detailed financial breakdown. They're obviously, one of the things they've been pre-briefing is that they're going to invest in borders. And I think it's for the reasons Luke's been talking about in terms of trying to talk to a part of the electorate that is being won over by reform. But there's some detail about that. I think it's what's not clear from these documents is how they're going to deliver on that. They're talking about having a £1 billion saving from not having. We know that putting up asylum seekers in hotels is very expensive. They claim they're going to save £1 billion. What's not in the document?
So that's
today.
assumed in the Home Office settlement, is it, that the Home Office is going to save £1 billion in all? And if it doesn't, then what's going to happen to that money?
Or how does it get there? That's what is not in the document, because it's very, very difficult to get that path. And actually local governments are really struggling to try and deal with that. There's lots of social care providers that talk to us that actually can't afford to give their social care provision, so they're handing the keys back to the local authority. Those properties are being used for asylum seekers. It's an endemic problem for local authorities, and I'm yet to see the details of how that's going to work. But as you said, it is a very political statement.
Just on the asylum hotels, the interesting thing is they have given themselves a measurable target on that now. And the truth is that asylum hotels, I would say, are the one policy which is the most toxic to social cohesion. Every focus group I do in an area which has a hotel, people will say, it's often the local heritage hotel, people will say, I go there once or twice a year for a wedding, I can't anymore. It obviously increases economic resentment because people say, well, people are getting full room and board in a nice hotel whilst I'm losing my winter fuel allowance or my benefits. It is a really key issue. And Labour have now said, we're going to stop that. And I think if they meet that, I think that helps them. I think if they fail to meet it, the public backlash would be significant there, and reform will be the big beneficiaries.
And as Helia says, they haven't said how they're going to meet it and where they're going to be putting up asylum seekers instead. Now, if they're putting them up in social care, then where are the old people going? And if they're putting them in affordable housing, where are the people who need affordable housing going?
Well, completely. And, we already hear in focus groups people saying to us, and they're offering landlords, more money to house asylum seekers rather than local people. This isn't easy. It's not like one policy is necessarily better. But I just think the hotels have become such an iconic sign for many people of a broken immigration and asylum system. And of course, it's bad for asylum seekers themselves. They can't put down roots. It's not great to grow, raise a family or anything like that in a hotel, but they're going to have to find a solution which washes with people, and I don't think that's going to be easy.
And does it shoot Reform's Fox?
Not on its own, because I think it helps. And because I think it's one of the most visible signs of the problem with channel crossings that people want to be addressed. But the truth is, the big thing which drives concern about channel crossings is people seeing those images of people crossing. And I think there is a growing acceptance in Labour, Labour and amongst the government, that simply the smash the gangs rhetoric isn't going to be enough to stop that. They're going to have to start exploring other things. But I think until they can make visible progress on that, it's going to be hard to deal with reform on migration issues.
As Luke was talking right at the beginning about, does the electorate know what this government is about? What do they respond to? It's not the traditional things that you vote Labour for. And I think more and more you're seeing certainly Rachel Reeves articulate her vision for the economy. And that economy is about protecting workers, creating strong kind of industry titans that are, building munitions, that are defending our country, that are creating jobs and creating skills, and that these two worlds protect ordinary working class people and create in regional areas where previous governments have failed. You talked about under the Boris Johnson years, but obviously levelling up never materialised. It was a big promise, never materialized. So do these kind of nuclear projects, do these energy projects, do they actually start to deliver for working class people?
I don't think it was a mistake that there was such a significant section in the speech on Scunthorpe and the steelworks, because we know that is one of the most popular things that this government has done, and it is a thing that people expect of Labour. It gives you some definition. In the section about defence, she wasn't just talking about defensive capability, she was talking about the jobs benefit of defence. And one of the things we know is that if you're going to raise more money for defence, cutting the aid budget was the easy bit. You've now got to convince people there are other benefits, such as jobs, that will make people be willing to pay more. And as I say, in that sense, it sounded much more like a sort of Wilsonian sort of white heat of technology style spending review, embracing the power of the state to facilitate that growth of industry. And I just wonder, it is entirely true that, look, only delivery will change the dial. But is it easier to sell a message when you have a message and a purpose to stand behind in the first place? And I think probably so, if they can continue to land it.
Now, Helia, one of the things
their line, Krish, is that, we can do much more than just step out of the way, which is the Tory position. The state can be involved. I think the problem is, and this is what we've seen from the October budget, is that if you want to keep business on side, actually raising, employer contributions through national insurance or raising the living wage is quite challenging. And if you look at what that's done in terms of confidence, that's been quite a hit for companies, especially at the low end. Retail, hospitality, all of these sectors have really struggled with the kind of changes that the government have brought in. So they're talking a big game when it comes to utilising company power, corporate power to boost economic growth. But when you talk to companies, sometimes there is a bit of a mismatch that's happening.
Just in the last couple of minutes, what might be confusing to viewers is that obviously so much of how this is judged is done through the prism of mass media. And mass media is banging on about tax rises in the budget. Now, is there a direct relationship, first of all, between what's happened today and what needs to happen in the budget? Or is that just a separate conversation that is inevitable? And what's driving it?
It's key to remember that in everything that was said, all of these documents that we're pouring through today, none of it's been looked at by the OBR. This is kind of freewheeling exercise of how we're going to spend the money. And to Luke's point earlier, you were saying, Luke, the big questions about welfare, which is not in this scope, haven't been addressed. And all of that is being pushed into autumn. And will she be able, today, again, she said, my fiscal rules are non-negotiable. Well, what does that mean? How are we going to raise the money to do all of these things? You know, the government's articulated lots of different ambitions, but the Treasury argument when you talk to civil servants is ministers aren't very realistic about what you can buy with the money you have. And at the moment, the money they have is very little. And unless they get growth, and remember growth, even though in the first quarter we did very well, it's not expected that it's going to continue on that trajectory. It's going to be challenging. And I think the one thing we haven't talked about is what does it mean in terms of the bond market? Because overarching everything is the one discipline that really, you know, kicks every politician up the arse, basically, is the bond market. At the moment, we pay about £107 billion in our debt interest bill. It's a huge spending line. And the bond markets in the world at the moment are very nervous, are very, you know, rickety. 1 minute they can just go against you. And if there's any kind of move, then it kind of deletes all of the government's ideas about spending on changing welfare payments, on spending on energy, on spending on health, or whatever it is, will get gobbled up by paying bondholders. So yes, she has to talk to the electorate, but there is another audience out there, and that other audience is the markets.
And so the Tory criticism that we're now going to spend a summer of speculation about which taxes are going up is right?
I mean, I think there is a sense that how do you pay for everything that you're saying you're going to do without raising taxes? It's very difficult. All of the growth ideas they have, which we've talked about earlier, are very long term. They may make a difference in a few years' time. They may, at the edges, make a difference even sooner, but it's not going to be transformational. So how do you keep within the fiscal rules and deliver on everything you say you want to deliver?
Look, how much
without tax rises? But remember, she said that last year was the last time that she would come back. She was absolutely explicit, the Chancellor, about not coming back for another big tax rise. So I think it puts her in a difficult quandary. But perhaps, you know, I don't know what Luke thinks, but perhaps they regret not coming in after they were elected and saying, you know what, the right thing is these tax plans from the previous government, they were for the birds. We're just going to chuck them out. We're going to reverse this national insurance cut. That doesn't make sense. We're going to cut it. That would have been a lot easier in retrospect for them than fuel payments and cutting employers, which got that backlash for the companies. But I mean, politics is a difficult landscape to decipher.
I couldn't agree more with that. There was the political space, particularly those two national insurance cuts, which no one noticed anyway. No one gave the government any credit for anyway. If they'd done that, they would have had the space to be able to do it. Instead, they box themselves in. And not only are they sort of grasping around for these small pots of money, what it means is they end up targeting particular groups who can then be very vocal. And if you ask people who they think is getting a bad settlement out of this government, I can tell you who's top of the list. It's farmers, pensioners and small businesses, all of the groups who have been, you know, drawn upon to try and plug the gap in the finances. And they can create much more political noise than something more broad-based. I know Labour was worried about the charge that, you know, Labour raises your taxes, but people got it at that stage.
But how damaging is it going to be? You know, when they're trying to get over the line this argument that, look, we're doing long-term decisions, big investments in health and defence, when the shouting and the noise, particularly in the media and in the opposition, is going to be, yeah, but they're going to put your taxes up.
Oh, yeah, I think that's going to be really difficult for them. I think they're going to now face, as you say, the summer of that. We know that people don't think that they personally, when you ask them, can afford to pay more in taxes. And they're also, and I think this is a sign of quite how broken lots of economics is. You know, I shouldn't be hearing about bond markets in focus groups from ordinary people, and yet they say that, right? They're talking about them. They're worried about them. I think we'll know when things are better when I don't hear that anymore, you know? So, and I think that's the challenge for them.
Is that not what you talk about loot around
sadly
the dinner
not.
party?
I'm sorry. No, but it's the run up to October now becomes more important as well, and it does seem. The danger is, are we lurching from make or break moment to make or break moment with this government,
and constantly
with the budget,
drawing lines.
and constantly drawing lines as the next one?
Well, Luke, Tryl, Helia, thank you both very much. That's the Forecast. We'll see you soon.